Darren Keene prided himself on being a man of leisure, someone who kept stress at arm's length. At 21, a junior majoring in literature at Crestwood University, his days were mostly spent navigating the fine line between scraping by academically and fully embracing the social chaos of campus life. But on this particular Thursday evening, leisure wasn't an option. A 10-page paper on Baudrillard's Simulacra loomed over him like a storm cloud, and he had done what any self-respecting procrastinator would: waited until the 11th hour to start. Crestwood's old library wasn't Darren's usual haunt. The modern annex was brighter, filled with sleek tables and the reassuring hum of coffee machines, a place where the diligent and caffeinated gathered. The old library, on the other hand, was its opposite, a relic from another time. Stone walls loomed high, wrapped in climbing ivy that seemed determined to swallow the place whole. Inside, dark wood shelves reached skyward, packed tight with books that no one had checked out in decades. It smelled faintly of mildew and age, as though the air itself had been trapped there since the 1800s. Darren settled at a table near a tall window, the kind with a pointed arch at the top. Outside, a crescent moon cast pale light over the campus. The place was quiet, eerily so. The librarians had gone home hours ago, leaving the space to the occasional desperate student like Darren. He cracked open his laptop, took out a book on critical theory, and began skimming for quotes. The minutes stretched. Darren fell into a rhythm, typing furiously as he pieced together his arguments. Then, somewhere between Baudrillard's critique of reality and his own half-formed thoughts, he heard it, a faint rustling. He paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, listening. The sound was soft, like someone flipping through pages far off in the stacks. Darren glanced around. The main floor was empty, as far as he could see. The sound stopped. Probably nothing, he muttered under his breath, returning to his paper. But a few minutes later, it came again. This time, it was closer. He craned his neck, peering into the dimly lit aisles of bookshelves. Shadows played tricks on his eyes, and the stacks seemed to stretch endlessly. "Hello?" he called, his voice bouncing faintly off the stone walls. No response. Darren shook his head. "Get a grip," he told himself. He picked up the book he'd been reading, a dense academic tome that weighed heavy in his hands, and flipped to the page he'd bookmarked. The paragraphs blurred together in their monotony, but then something happened that made his blood run cold. The text began to change. At first, he thought it was a trick of his tired eyes, the way the letters seemed to shift and shimmer. But then the words rearranged themselves right there on the page. Whole sentences twisted and warped, melting away and reforming into something else entirely. "Why did you leave her to die, Darren?" His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He slammed the book shut, the echo ringing out in the silence. His breathing quickened. It wasn't possible. The words couldn't have just changed. He stared at the closed cover, his hands trembling. The memory came rushing back, unbidden. A rainy night 2 years ago, a car skidding off a slick road, and the sound of shattering glass. The voice on the page had dredged it up, forcing it to the surface like a corpse from a swamp. He hadn't told anyone, not his parents, not his friends. No one knew the truth about that night. But the book did. The rustling sound returned, louder now. It wasn't coming from the book in his hands. It was coming from deeper in the stacks. Darren's rational mind screamed at him to leave, to pack up his things and never set foot in this place again. But something else, a morbid curiosity maybe, drove him to his feet. He followed the sound, each step hesitant. The air seemed colder back here, the dim lighting giving way to deeper shadows. The rows of shelves stretched endlessly, their contents growing older and stranger the further he ventured. Then he saw it. A door. It was small, arched at the top, and carved directly into the stone wall. Darren stopped, frowning. He'd walked through this section plenty of times before. He would have noticed something like this. Yet there it was, as real as the air he breathed. Above the door, a tarnished brass plaque bore the words, "Restricted Archives." Darren hesitated, his hand hovering near the door handle. The rustling sound was unmistakable now, coming from just beyond it. He felt a strange pull, as though the door were calling to him. "This is stupid," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He glanced back over his shoulder. The library was silent, empty. He was alone. Summoning what little courage he had, Darren gripped the cold brass handle and twisted. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward. From the darkness below, the rustling grew louder, accompanied by the faint scent of old paper and something else, something metallic, like blood. Darren's pulse quickened. He knew he should turn back, slam the door shut, and run. But instead, he stepped through. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, and Darren descended into the unknown. The stairs were ancient, carved from stone that bore the weight of centuries. Darren gripped the iron handrail, cold and rough beneath his palm, and took each step with caution. The spiral staircase was narrow, its steps uneven and slick with condensation. The further he descended, the more the air changed. It thickened, carrying a damp, metallic tang that coated his throat. The rustling sound grew louder, joined now by an almost imperceptible whispering. Darren paused, his heart hammering. He strained his ears, trying to make sense of the faint murmurs. They didn't form words, not any he could recognize, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, beckoning. He glanced back up the staircase. The doorway he'd come through was gone, replaced by solid stone. Panic flared in his chest. This couldn't be happening. Doors didn't just vanish. "Okay," he muttered under his breath, his voice shaking. "Just keep it together." The whispers grew louder, encouraging him to move forward. Darren continued his descent, each step pulling him deeper into the unknown. After what felt like an eternity, the staircase ended. He found himself standing in a long, narrow hallway lit by flickering sconces mounted on the walls. The flames cast shifting shadows, making the walls seem alive. The rustling sound was everywhere now, a constant backdrop to the whispering. The hallway stretched before him, its floor lined with a threadbare red carpet. At the far end, he could just make out a heavy wooden door, its surface carved with intricate symbols. Darren swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but there was nowhere to go. The library, his world, was behind that door. As he approached, he noticed details that made his skin crawl. The symbols on the door weren't random. They were faces, dozens of them. Twisted, anguished expressions frozen in the wood grain. Their eyes seemed to follow him as he stepped closer, and Darren had the unnerving feeling they weren't just carvings. With a trembling hand, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was enormous, far larger than the space above ground could have allowed. Shelves rose impossibly high, filled with books of every size and color. The air hummed with a strange energy, and the smell of old paper mingled with that metallic scent that Darren couldn't shake. The whispers grew louder as he stepped inside, a cacophony of voices overlapping until they formed a single chilling phrase. "Welcome, Darren." He froze. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. The room fell silent, as if the library itself were holding its breath. Then a single book slid off a nearby shelf and landed on the floor with a soft thud. Darren approached it cautiously, every muscle in his body tense. The book was bound in dark leather, its surface cracked and worn. There was no title on the cover, just a faint embossed symbol that looked like an eye. Against his better judgment, he picked it up. The leather was cool to the touch, and the book felt heavier than it should have. He opened it to the first page. The words were written in a flowing, elegant script, and they told a story, a familiar one. It was his story. The book described Darren's life in unnerving detail, from his childhood in suburban Michigan to the night 2 years ago when everything changed. As he turned the pages, he found himself reliving that night. The rain, the sharp curve on the road, the flash of headlights, and the deafening crash. His hands began to shake as he read the next part. She begged you to help her, but you ran. You left her there, alone in the dark, to die. No, Darren whispered, slamming the book shut. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the library didn't care about his protests. Another book fell from the shelves, then another, until a dozen of them surrounded him. Each one was unique, bound in leather, cloth, or even what looked disturbingly like human skin. Darren stared at them, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. Read, they urged. Darren shook his head, backing away. No, I'm not doing this. The room seemed to react to his defiance. The shelves groaned, the books shuddering in their places. A low, guttural growl echoed through the space, and Darren felt the floor tremble beneath his feet. Then, without warning, one of the books flew open. The pages flipped wildly before settling on a specific passage. Darren's eyes were drawn to it against his will. The words described him in the present, standing in the forgotten library, refusing to read the stories it offered. They described his fear, his denial, and, most chillingly, his future. If he does not read, he will not leave. The library does not forgive. Darren's pulse thundered in his ears. He had to get out of here. Dropping the book in his hands, he turned and sprinted toward the door, but the room wasn't done with him. The shelves began to shift, moving like the teeth of a great machine. They closed in around him, narrowing the path back to the door. The whispers turned to screams, a deafening chorus that filled his head and drowned out his thoughts. "Let me out," he shouted, clawing at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the books rose from the floor, hovering in the air like vultures circling a dying animal. Darren turned, pressing his back against the door. His eyes darted from one book to the next, his mind racing for a way out. Then he saw it, a single book, glowing faintly on a nearby shelf. Unlike the others, it wasn't bound in leather or cloth. Its cover was smooth and black, like polished obsidian, and it seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. The whispers faded, replaced by a single voice. It was soft and melodic, almost soothing. "This one will set you free." Darren didn't trust it. He didn't trust any of this, but he was out of options. He lunged for the glowing book, grabbing it with both hands. The moment he touched it, the world around him dissolved into darkness. The darkness was absolute, swallowing Darren whole the moment his fingers touched the glowing book. It wasn't like closing his eyes or walking into a dark room. This was something else, something alive. The air pressed against him, thick and suffocating, as though he'd been buried alive in black ink. Then came the sound, a low rhythmic thrum, like the beating of a massive heart. It pulsed through the void, and with each beat, faint shapes began to emerge. Darren saw shelves looming out of the darkness, impossibly tall and curving at unnatural angles. Books jutted from them like teeth, some glowing faintly, others leaking shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. The glow from the book in his hands was his only anchor. He clung to it, fingers digging into the obsidian cover as though it were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. The whispers returned, soft at first, then rising into a crescendo of overlapping voices. "Read," they urged, their tone somewhere between a command and a plea. "No," Darren whispered, shaking his head. His voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast oppressive space. "I'm not playing your game." The library disagreed. The shelves began to move, grinding and shifting like the gears of some ancient machine. Books fell from their places, landing around Darren with sickening wet thuds. He flinched, glancing down, and his stomach lurched. These weren't books. Not entirely. The covers were flesh, human skin, mottled and veined, stretched tight over pages that pulsed as though alive. Some of the books were still moving, their spines twitching, their pages fluttering in shallow, labored breaths. Darren stumbled back, his hands trembling. "What the hell is this place?" he muttered. A single voice broke through the cacophony, deep and resonant. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through his bones. "This is knowledge, Darren, true knowledge, and it demands sacrifice." The glow from the book in his hands intensified, and Darren felt its pull again, that insidious, almost magnetic urge to open it. He resisted, gripping the edges so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "No," he said through gritted teeth. "I didn't ask for this." "But you came to us," the voice replied, calm and implacable. The air around him grew colder, and Darren could see his breath misting in the dim light. The shelves closed in tighter, pressing him toward the center of the room. There, a pedestal rose from the ground, its surface slick and black like polished obsidian. The glowing book in his hands grew heavier, pulling him forward. No matter how hard he tried to resist, his feet moved of their own accord. He stumbled toward the pedestal, the whispers growing louder with each step. When he reached it, the book wrenched itself free of his grasp and settled onto the pedestal with a dull thud. Darren stared at it, his chest heaving. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. Then slowly, the book opened. Its pages were unlike anything Darren had ever seen. They shimmered with an oily iridescence, their surfaces rippling like water. As he watched, the words began to form, not written, but etched in lines of fire that burned and twisted across the page. The text told a story. Not his story this time, but something older. It spoke of the library's origins, of a place that existed outside of time and space. A nexus of knowledge, it said, where every truth, every secret, every dark thought that had ever existed was recorded. The books were alive, feeding on the fears and desires of those who dared to read them. "To know is to pay," the text read. Darren's eyes were drawn to the next line, but the words blurred and shifted before he could make sense of them. His head throbbed, and he felt a sharp pain behind his eyes, as though the book were burrowing into his mind. "Stop," he whispered, clutching his temples. "Stop it." The book ignored him. Its pages turned on their own, faster now, the words flashing by in a blur of light and shadow. Darren tried to look away, but his body wouldn't obey. His eyes were locked on the book, his mind assaulted by images that defied comprehension. He saw faces, thousands of them, twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. He saw places that shouldn't exist, cities of bone and rivers of blood, skies that burned with black fire. And he saw himself, standing in the library, a faint glow surrounding him as the books closed in. Then, the images changed. He saw the night of the accident again, but it wasn't how he remembered it. The rain, the curve in the road, the headlights, They were all the same. But this time, the book was there. It sat on the passenger seat of his car, glowing faintly, its cover turned toward him like a watching eye. "No," Darren whispered, his voice trembling. "That's not what happened. That's not." "You cannot escape the truth," the voice interrupted, cutting through his denial like a blade. The book snapped shut, and Darren staggered back, gasping for air. His vision swam, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse. When he regained his balance, the room had changed again. The shelves were closer now, their books leering at him like open wounds. The whispers returned, soft and mocking. "Read another," they said. Darren shook his head, backing away. "I'm done. I'm not reading anything else." The library seemed to laugh, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the air. "You don't have a choice," the voice said. Another book slid from the shelves, landing at Darren's feet. Its cover was bound in dark, cracked leather, and a single word was scrawled across it, in what looked like dried blood. Hers. He didn't want to pick it up. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to leave it alone. But as the library closed in around him, he realized he had no way out. With shaking hands, he reached down and lifted the book. It opened to the first page, and Darren's world began to unravel. The book in Darren's hands felt heavier than it should have, as though it were infused with something far denser than paper and ink. The leather binding was warm, almost pulsing under his fingertips, and the single word etched on the cover, "hers," seemed to radiate malice. Darren didn't want to open it, but the library had other plans. The cover flipped open on its own, and the pages began to turn, stopping somewhere near the middle. A faint breeze stirred his hair, though the air was still and suffocating. The first words on the page were in blood-red ink, and they hit him like a punch to the gut. "She never forgave you, Darren. Why would she?" "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. His fingers tightened around the edges of the book, as though he could force it shut through sheer willpower. "This isn't real. You're just messing with me." But the words continued to appear, crawling across the page like insects. The book told the story of a young woman named Alyssa, her hopes, her fears, her dreams. Darren didn't need to read her name to know who she was. He could see her in his mind's eye, as clearly as if she were standing in front of him. Her auburn hair curling wildly around her face, her bright green eyes, the way she used to laugh with her whole body. The book wasn't just telling her story, it was showing it to him. The air around him shimmered, and suddenly, he was no longer standing in the library. He was in her car, the familiar scent of cheap pine air freshener and coffee filling his nostrils. The rain lashed against the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up. Alyssa was beside him, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. Her face was pale, her jaw set with determination. "I can't believe you," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Do you even care about anyone but yourself?" Darren opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. He wasn't in control, not really. He was reliving the moment, trapped in a memory that played out with cruel precision. "It's not like that," his voice said, though it didn't feel like his own. "You're blowing this out of proportion." Alyssa let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Of course you'd say that. You always have an excuse, don't you? Always some reason why it's not your fault." The scene shifted. The road curved sharply, and the headlights of an oncoming car cut through the rain like a blade. Darren tried to look away, but his body refused to obey. The crash came, sudden and violent. The sound of shattering glass and twisting metal filled the air, followed by an eerie silence. Darren blinked, and the memory shifted again. This time, he was standing on the side of the road, rain soaking through his clothes. Alyssa was trapped in the car, her head slumped against the steering wheel. Blood trickled down her face, mixing with the rainwater that dripped from her chin. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Darren took a step back. His younger self, the version of him that had been there that night, was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. He could see it now with painful clarity, the way his hands shook, the way his mind raced with excuses. If he stayed, he might get in trouble. The cops would come. They'd ask questions he didn't want to answer. So he ran. The memory faded, and Darren was back in the library, the book still open in his hands. His chest heaved as he fought to catch his breath. The words on the page blurred and shifted, forming a new sentence. "You left her to die, Darren." And she did. "Stop it," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to what?" The deep voice from before interrupted, cutting through his protest like a scalpel. "Leave her? Run away? Pretend it never happened?" The room seemed to tilt, the shelves leaning inward as if the library itself were closing in on him. Darren stumbled, clutching the book to his chest. "She's gone," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I can't change that." "But you can pay," the voice said, calm and implacable. Another book fell from the shelves, landing at his feet. This one was smaller, its cover black and featureless. Darren didn't want to pick it up, but the pull was irresistible. He crouched down, his hands trembling, and opened it. The pages were blank at first, but as he stared, words began to form. They described a deal, a way to make amends. "The library offers you a choice," the text read. "A chance to undo the past, to save her. But every choice has a cost." Darren's heart raced. A chance to save Alyssa? To undo the worst mistake of his life? "What kind of cost?" he asked aloud, his voice shaky. The library didn't answer directly. Instead, the room shifted again. The shelves receded, and Darren found himself standing in a smaller, darker space. A single table stood in the center, and on it rested a quill and an open book. The book's pages were blank, but Darren instinctively understood what he was supposed to do. He stepped forward, his legs feeling like lead. The quill was made of bone, its tip sharp and glistening with a dark red liquid. He didn't need to be told that it was blood, his blood. "Write her name," the voice said. "Write it, and she will live." Darren hesitated. The pull was overwhelming, but a small part of him screamed in protest. This was wrong. It was all wrong. "What happens if I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The library will take what it is owed," the voice replied. Darren's eyes flicked to the book. His mind raced with possibilities, with doubts and fears. But Alyssa's face haunted him, her final words echoing in his mind. "Help me." He reached for the quill. The moment his fingers touched it, a searing pain shot through his hand, but he didn't pull back. He dipped the tip into the open book and began to write. The moment her name was complete, the room exploded with light. The light that exploded from the book was blinding, consuming Darren entirely. For a moment, he thought it would burn him alive, the heat so intense it felt like his skin might peel away. But just as quickly as it came, the light vanished, leaving him standing in utter darkness once again. Only this time, it wasn't the oppressive, alive darkness of the library. This was something different, quiet, still, and strangely cold. Darren blinked, his eyes adjusting to the faint glow of moonlight streaming through a window. His heart skipped a beat as he realized where he was. Alyssa's apartment. Everything was as he remembered it. The cluttered desk piled high with textbooks, the half-empty mug of tea on the nightstand, the faint smell of lavender from the candle she always forgot to blow out. He stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. And then he saw her. Alyssa was curled up on the couch, her auburn hair spilling over her shoulder. She was alive, alive and here, as if the accident had never happened. Darren's knees almost gave out, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over him. "Alyssa," he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they locked onto his. Those green eyes, so vibrant and full of life, stared at him with a mixture of confusion and something else. "Darren," she said, sitting up slowly. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "What are you doing here?" He struggled for words, his mind reeling. I needed to see you." Alyssa tilted her head, studying him. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a rough night." Her expression softened, and she patted the cushion beside her. "Come sit. Tell me what's going on." Darren hesitated. Something about the moment felt too perfect, too fragile, like it could shatter if he moved too quickly. But the pull of her presence was stronger than his fear. He crossed the room and sat beside her, the warmth of her body grounding him. For a while, they just sat in silence, the quiet hum of the city outside filling the gaps. Darren wanted to say something, anything, but his throat felt like it was closing. Alyssa broke the silence first. "You look terrible," she said, her lips quirking into a small smile. Darren chuckled, though it came out more like a choke. "Thanks. Nice to see you too." Her smile faded, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "Seriously, Darren, what's going on? You're scaring me." He looked down at their hands, his heart aching. How could he explain any of it? The library, the books, the deal he'd made to bring her back. She wouldn't believe him. Hell, he barely believed it himself. I missed you," he said finally. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough. Alyssa's expression softened, and she squeezed his hand. "I missed you too." For a moment, everything felt right. The weight he'd been carrying since the accident seemed to lift, replaced by a warmth he hadn't felt in years. But that moment was short-lived. The first sign that something was wrong came as a faint rustling sound. Darren's head snapped up, his eyes darting around the room. "What was that?" he asked, his voice sharp. Alyssa frowned. "What was what?" The rustling grew louder, like pages being flipped in rapid succession. Darren's stomach dropped as he realized the sound was coming from behind him. Slowly, he turned his head. The book was there. It sat on Alyssa's desk, its cover closed but trembling, as though something inside it was trying to escape. Darren's blood turned to ice. He didn't remember bringing it here. Hell, he didn't even know how he'd gotten here in the first place. "Darren?" Alyssa's voice was laced with concern. "What's going on?" He shot to his feet, his eyes locked on the book. "Stay back," he said, his voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" Alyssa asked, standing as well. "Darren, you're scaring me." The book flew open, its pages flipping wildly. The air in the room grew heavy, and a low hum filled Darren's ears. He stumbled back, his heart pounding. "No," he whispered. "No, this isn't part of the deal." The words on the pages began to glow, twisting and rearranging themselves. Darren didn't need to read them to know what they said. The library always collects. Alyssa took a step toward him, her hand outstretched. "Darren, talk to me. What's going on?" Before he could respond, the book exploded with light, just as it had in the library. The force of it knocked Darren to the ground, and when he looked up, his blood ran cold. Alyssa was no longer standing in front of him. She was frozen in place, her body rigid, her eyes wide with terror. Dark veins spread across her skin, pulsing and twisting like living things. "No," Darren choked out, crawling toward her. "No, no, no." The veins crawled up her neck, wrapping around her throat. Her mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound came out. Darren reached for her, his fingers brushing against her arm, and recoiled as her skin turned cold as ice. The library's voice echoed in his mind, calm and relentless. "You brought her back, Darren, but everything has a price." "No," he screamed, slamming his fists against the floor. Take me instead." The room began to dissolve, the walls fading into shadow. Darren clung to Alyssa, his tears falling onto her lifeless face. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was her green eyes, staring back at him with a mixture of love and fear. And then she was gone. Darren was alone again, back in the library. The shelves loomed around him, and the whispers returned, soft and mocking. "You cannot escape, Darren. The library always collects." He collapsed to the floor, his body shaking with sobs. He had brought her back, only to lose her again. And now, he realized, he was trapped. The glowing book sat before him, its pages blank once more. But Darren knew the library wasn't done with him. Not yet. It would demand more. The floor of the library felt colder now, the chill seeping into Darren's bones as he sat slumped against one of the towering shelves. His chest heaved, his face damp with tears, but he could feel something else bubbling underneath the grief, a quiet, simmering rage. The library had cheated him. It had offered him hope, dangled redemption in front of him, and snatched it away. It had used Alyssa as a pawn, tearing her away for the second time. The glowing book that had stolen her sat a few feet away, its cover closed but pulsating faintly, as though it were breathing. Darren wanted to tear it apart, to rip it into shreds, but some instinct told him that would be useless. The library would not be undone by brute force. The whispers grew louder around him, slithering into his ears like venomous snakes. They spoke in fragments, a dissonant choir of voices, some deep and guttural, others high-pitched and mocking. He thought he could outsmart us. The fool played our game. He has more to give. They always do. "Shut up," Darren screamed, his voice echoing through the endless expanse of the library. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly as he glared at the shelves around him. "You think I'm just going to sit here and let you take everything from me? I'm not done fighting." The whispers paused for a moment, as if surprised by his defiance. Then, the deep voice that had first spoken to him returned, smooth and unhurried, carrying the weight of inevitability. "Fighting is good, Darren. It makes the game more interesting." Darren clenched his fists. "What do you want from me? What the hell do you want?" The voice chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent shivers down his spine. "We want what you promised. A price must always be paid." "I already paid," Darren shouted. "I gave you what you wanted. I brought her back, and you—" His voice broke, and he looked away, his anger faltering under the weight of his grief. "You took her from me. Again." "Ah, but you misunderstand," the voice said, its tone almost pitying. "You did not give her to us. She was collateral damage, an unfortunate side effect of your inability to follow the rules." Darren's jaw tightened. What rules? The room around him shifted. The shelves groaned and twisted, bending unnaturally as the space transformed into a wide circular chamber. At its center stood a massive, ornate desk made of dark wood, its surface covered in scattered papers, quills, and ancient tomes. Behind the desk sat a figure. It was cloaked in shadow, its features impossible to make out. All Darren could see were its hands, long, bony fingers that tapped rhythmically against the desk's surface. The figure gestured toward one of the books on the desk, and it floated into the air, its pages opening to reveal glowing text. "You were told the terms," the figure said, its voice calm but commanding. "You were given a choice, to write her name and save her, or to walk away. You made your decision, but you failed to understand the nature of our agreement." "What are you talking about?" Darren demanded. The book floated closer to him, the words rearranging themselves on the page. They described the deal he had made, but now the text revealed something he hadn't seen before, a clause written in faint, almost invisible ink. Those who seek to alter fate must offer more than memory. They must offer a part of themselves. Darren's heart sank. What does that mean? The figure leaned forward slightly, its shadowy presence pressing against him. "It means, Darren, that saving Alyssa required more than a simple signature. You bound yourself to the library, and in doing so, you became ours." "No," Darren whispered, shaking his head. "That wasn't the deal. You tricked me." "Did we?" the figure asked, its tone mocking. "Or were you simply too desperate to read the fine print?" Darren felt a surge of anger, hot and blinding. "Let me go," he growled. "I don't care what it takes, just let me go." The figure tilted its head, as though considering his words. Then, it gestured toward another book on the desk. This one was smaller, its cover marked with a single word: release. "There is a way," the figure said, "but it will not be easy, and the cost will be higher than you can imagine." Darren hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't trust the library, not after everything it had done. But if there was even the slightest chance of escape, he had to take it. "What's the cost?" he asked warily. The figure's hands stopped tapping, and the room grew eerily silent. When it spoke again, its voice was softer, almost intimate. "You must give up what remains of your humanity, your memories, your identity, your soul. They will become ours. In exchange, we will grant you freedom. You will walk away from this place, unburdened by the weight of your past." Darren's stomach churned. "You're asking me to erase myself." "We are offering you release," the figure corrected. "A chance to escape the pain you carry, a chance to start anew." Darren's mind flashed with images. Alyssa's smile, the way she used to tease him about his messy handwriting, the sound of her laugh. He thought of the accident, the crushing guilt that had haunted him every day since. Could he really give all of that up? Could he trade his memories, his very essence, for freedom? "I need to think," he said finally, his voice trembling. The figure leaned back, its presence receding slightly. "Take your time, Darren. But know this, the longer you delay, the stronger the library's hold will become. And once it consumes you completely, there will be no choice left to make." The room began to shift again, the circular chamber dissolving into the familiar maze of shelves. Darren found himself alone once more, the whispers surrounding him like a suffocating fog. He sank to the floor, his head in his hands. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, crushing him from all sides. Freedom or identity, escape or oblivion. It was a choice no one should ever have to make. But in the depths of the forgotten library, choices were never fair. The air in the library grew heavier as Darren sat on the cold, endless floor. The shadows seemed to press closer now, almost sentient, in their suffocating embrace. His mind churned with the weight of the figure's offer, the promise of freedom taunting him. The whispers danced around him, louder and more insistent. Choose, Darren. There's no way out but through. Time is slipping. He clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms as he tried to focus. The thought of losing himself completely, his memories, his identity, was unthinkable. But staying here, trapped in this nightmare, wasn't an option either. I won't lose, Darren muttered under his breath. The glowing book labeled Release still lingered in his mind, its promise echoing like a siren's call. But as the figure had said, it came at a price Darren wasn't sure he could pay. His eyes darted around the library, desperate for a sign, a clue, something he might have missed. And then he remembered the other books, the ones filled with secrets, with the rewritten lives of those who had come before him. What if they're the answer? He whispered to himself. Summoning what courage he had left, Darren stood and moved toward the nearest shelf. His fingers grazed the spines of the books, each one radiating a faint warmth, as though alive. He pulled one out, its leather cover cool against his skin, and opened it. The pages fluttered to life, glowing faintly as words began to form. Darren's eyes scanned the text, and his heart raced as he realized what he was reading. It was a story, someone else's story. A man named Henry, who had stumbled into the library decades ago. Like Darren, he had been offered a choice, and like Darren, he had resisted. The story ended abruptly, with Henry's name fading into oblivion. Darren slammed the book shut, his pulse pounding. They're all trapped here, he murmured. He reached for another book, then another. Each one told the same tale. People drawn into the library, their hopes exploited, their choices stolen, and every single one ended the same way, with their souls consumed. The library wasn't just a prison, it was a predator. His breath quickened as a terrifying realization hit him. The figure hadn't lied. It would keep feeding, no matter what Darren chose. If he took the deal, he might escape, but someone else would take his place. No, he said, his voice trembling but resolute. Not this time. He closed his eyes and thought of Alyssa, her laughter, her warmth, the way she used to hum absent-mindedly when she was lost in thought. The memory of her face, frozen in terror as the library consumed her, was a knife in his chest. He wouldn't let her sacrifice be meaningless. "Show yourself," Darren shouted, his voice echoing through the endless expanse. The shadows thickened, swirling into the air like smoke. The figure emerged once more, seated behind its desk, its skeletal fingers steepled as it regarded him. "You've made your decision?" it asked, its tone calm, but laced with menace. "Yes," Darren said, stepping forward, "but I'm not playing your game anymore." The figure tilted its head, as if amused. "And what do you plan to do, Darren? Fight us? You cannot defeat the library. You are but a speck in its design." Darren smirked, though fear still gripped his chest. "Maybe I can't destroy you, but I can make sure you never do this to anyone else." He held up one of the books he'd taken from the shelf. The pages glowed faintly, but Darren's focus was on the binding, the thin threads of energy that seemed to pulse through it, connecting it to the library itself. The figure stiffened. "What are you doing?" "I've seen your rules," Darren said, his voice steady now. "Every story in this library is connected, right? These books are your power. Without them, you're nothing." The figure rose from its chair, its shadowy form expanding, filling the space. The whispers turned into a roar, a cacophony of voices shouting over one another. "Stop! You don't understand. You will doom us all." Darren ignored them, He grabbed another book and opened it, tearing a page from its spine. The glow flickered, then dimmed, as though the life had been drained from it. The entire library seemed to tremble, the shelves groaning under some invisible weight. The figure lunged forward, its hands outstretched, but Darren was faster. He grabbed more books, ripping pages, tossing them aside. The glow from the shelves dimmed with each book he destroyed, the whispers growing weaker, more fragmented. The library was unraveling. "You think you own us?" Darren shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "You think you can keep feeding on people's lives? Not anymore." The figure let out a roar, a sound that shook the ground beneath Darren's feet. It surged toward him, its shadowy form twisting and writhing. But it was too late. Darren had reached the glowing book labeled Release. With one final motion, he tore it in half. The library exploded. A blinding light consumed everything, and Darren felt himself being pulled upward, weightless and free. For a moment, he thought he heard Alyssa's voice, soft and comforting, whispering his name. Then the light faded, and Darren was standing outside. The night was calm, the air crisp and cool. He blinked, disoriented, as he realized he was standing in the park, where he'd first found the library's entrance. But the strange oak tree was gone, replaced by an ordinary patch of grass. He looked down at his hands, half expecting to see them glowing or disintegrating, but they were solid, real. He was free. Darren sank to his knees, the weight of everything he'd endured crashing down on him. He had won. He had beaten the library. But as he sat there, staring at the empty patch of earth, a chilling thought crept into his mind. The library was gone. But for how long? He had broken the system, torn it apart from the inside. But things like the library didn't simply vanish. They waited. They evolved. And Darren knew, deep down, that it would return someday. When it did, he would be ready.